Welcome to Books and Ideas Audio, a presentation of the Vancouver Writers Fest. The Vancouver Writers Fest connects people to exceptional books, ideas, and dialogue through year-round programming that ignites a passion for words and the world around us. I'm Leslie Hurtig, Artistic Director, and I'm very happy to share this conversation featuring journalist Joanna Chiu in conversation with the Globe and Mail's Doug Saunders about her new book, China Unbound, A New World Disorder. This conversation was recorded for the Vancouver Writers Fest's 34th annual festival. Welcome to the 34th season of the Vancouver Writers Fest. My name is Leslie Hurtig. We are so happy that you could join us at our fall festival, and thank goodness for the technology that allows us to connect readers in and around Vancouver and across British Columbia with remarkable writers and journalists like Joanna Chiu joining us today from Toronto and Doug Saunders joining us from Berlin. The Vancouver Writers Fest carries out its work and this event today on the traditional, unceded, and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We are grateful to be here and are cognizant of the history of these lands and the necessary work that is still to come as we move toward reconciliation and Indigenous sovereignty. In a year like this, we are more grateful than ever for the support we've received from donors and sponsors. I'd like to take a moment to thank our public sector funders, the Government of Canada, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Government of BC, the BC Arts Council, the City of Vancouver, and CMHC Granville Island. These funders make events like this one a reality, and we couldn't do our work without them. And now I'd like to introduce you to our host and our guest author. Doug Saunders is a multi-award-winning author and journalist. He is the author of 3 books, most recently Maximum Canada, Toward a Country of 100 Million. Currently a resident of Berlin, he is also the international affairs columnist for the Globe and Mail. He served as the paper's London-based European bureau chief for a decade after having run the paper's Los Angeles bureau, and has written extensively from East Asia, the Indian subcontinent, the Middle East, and North Africa. He writes a weekly column devoted to the larger themes and intellectual concepts behind international news, and his current work examines the neighborhood-scale manifestation of larger social and economic crises with fieldwork in 7 countries. And now for our guest author, Joanna Chiu. With so much going on in the world, understanding the complex implications of just one country's growing dominance can be daunting. And it's at times like these that we're especially grateful for writers like Joanna Chiu, an internationally recognized authority on China, to help us contextualize such rapid geopolitical change. Having spent 7 years as a foreign correspondent in Beijing and Hong Kong, Joanna's experiences have led her to the realization that China's increasing authoritarianism has serious global repercussions. With her new book, China Unbound, Joanna hopes to create an engaging text that anyone in the world can use to critically evaluate any China-related issue. Praised by The Economist as an eye-opening global tour of the growing influence of the new superpower, we believe that is exactly what she has done with this new book. Please welcome Joanna Chiu and Doug Saunders.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you everybody for coming here, and thank you especially to Joanna Chiu for taking this time. I think in previous times, this would have been unusual circumstances for a book festival conversation, given that I am 9 time zones away from Joanna in Berlin right now. Yet somehow it seems very fitting and almost appropriate, given the scope and geographic breadth of Joanna Chiu's book, China Unbound. In this book, she chronicles her travels to Australia, Italy, Greece, Turkey, Russia, the United States, Canada, and all over China and Hong Kong, in a work that broadly looks at President Xi Jinping's expanding web of influence around the world. So, Joanna, as a way to get into this on a very individual scale, I wonder if you can tell me, about a third of the way into the book, we meet a young man who you call Dan, who was a student in Canada. And well, broadly, can you tell us what he experienced?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, first of all, for the Vancouver Writers Fest for having us both. And it does seem fitting that I'm in Vancouver, you're in Berlin, because my mind has been so global in the last few years, because I've been working in Vancouver for the Toronto Star while sneaking off throughout 2019 to do reporting for this book, building on my 7 years reporting on the ground in China, which the book also draws from. So like you said, the book has a lot of individual stories. So Dan, he was a student from China, a Chinese citizen, who messaged me out of the blue a couple of years ago, just as I was working on researching this book and writing stories for the Toronto Star about China's foreign influence efforts. I think those who follow China news, there's these buzzwords like foreign interference or united front, and things that sound scary and ominous and really big and almost important, but also kind of amorphous, kind of quite abstract. But with the book and my reporting work, I really wanted to make it clear to people what it actually means for individuals. So Dan, he was a student, a law student. I think he just graduated from a Canadian university, but he was so excited that he was admitted to this Canadian university, and he was going to leave China for the first time to study overseas in Canada. Just before he started classes, his school issued him a VPN. So for the first time, he felt safe enough, knowing the situation in China of the really heavy censorship of the internet, to actually explore global social media for the first time. So he set up his first ever Twitter account, his first ever account outside, the Chinese internet. And with an anonymous name, he even set his gender to female, the location nowhere in China. And he was amazed that there were already so many Chinese language users who were speaking freely about a whole host of political issues that are strictly censored in China. And he just wanted to test it out. He himself wasn't very political. He was very devoted to the study of the law and not getting involved as any kind of political activist. So he only, just to see if it worked, basically retweeted a few posts. One was a satirical video about Xi Jinping. Another was commemorating the death of Liu Xiaobo, who was a Nobel Peace Prize laureate who died in Chinese police custody a couple years ago. So that's all he did, and he went on and continued his studies and almost forgot that he had a Twitter account. He was just testing it out. But out of the blue, his father called him from China saying, "Son, did you do something? Police visited us and said that you're in trouble." So his dad was really, really upset and worried about what could have been going on. So Dan, he was very surprised. Like, is this just about the fact that I opened a Twitter account? He wasn't sure. But soon enough, a Chinese police officer called him and said and threatened him, like, "We found you. We know where you live in Canada. We know it was your Twitter account that had these posts." Meanwhile, Dan only had 2 followers on Twitter. He wasn't influential on the site by any respect. And he felt like he shouldn't have to do that. He shouldn't have to delete those posts because he was living in Quebec. He was a law student. He didn't even say anything. He just was testing out the platform. But eventually he decided to do as the police asked and deleted those posts because you will face trouble, which is what the police told him is a euphemism that people who follow Chinese legal and political issues would recognize as meaning that a whole host of consequences could take place. It could mean he could have trouble finding a job when he's back in China. He could have trouble finding an apartment, or it could mean his family might be detained. He might be detained, in the extreme end of things. So he didn't want to risk that. So he ended up deleting those posts. But first, he did reach out to Canadian police. He tried to report the case because he felt it was pretty brazen that, using a VPN in Canada, that he would be tracked down like that. He thought that Canadian authorities might at least find his case interesting, might be able to help other people who might be in the same position. But Quebec police, according to him, did not even take down his statement, said, you can do whatever you want. It's a free country in Canada. Why are you worried? Like, you could say whatever you feel like. It's not an issue. Chinese police don't have jurisdiction here. But they did not understand how Beijing uses all these tactics to silence its critics overseas. If they have family or friends in China, that's all the better, because that's leverage that they have to try to silence people. And this, in Australia, one of my case studies, I found people who weren't of Chinese descent, even though people of Chinese descent are usually the main targets, people who merely, had ties with China, had good friends in China, using that leverage. Beijing officials, police also try to really put pressure on its foreign critics to try to silence them.
The story of Dan is an amazing illustration. Well, on one hand, of Canada's lackadaisical approach to the two countries that interfere with their nationals or even ethnically identified people within the country, and we'll get to that. But the thing that really stands out is just the size of the Chinese state bureaucratic apparatus that's devoted to what would seem to be very petty vendettas against people. I mean, here's a guy, as you say, he had exactly 2 Twitter followers in an account that he'd never said anything on, and he retweeted 2 fairly mild things. And it's evident that this triggered an operation both within the Chinese bureaucracy and involving police to be summoned and that sort of thing, all for this one guy. And it's quite apparent from your work in other countries that he is far from an exception or an atypical example. Now, as you note, what Dan appears to have fallen afoul of is a branch of the Chinese government known as the United Front Work Department, and especially a new sub-bureaucracy of that was created a few years ago. In fact, I think it would almost be fair to describe much of China Unbound as a tour of the United Front Work Department's activities around the world as they impinge on not just Chinese, but people who are simply ethnically Chinese, or even people who are not, who somehow offend the Chinese state. So tell us about the United Front Work Department and how it's evolved.
Yeah, so United Front Work, it kind of, the roots are in kind of like the Russian Revolution, where the idea was that a war can be fought not only on a battlefield, but also through winning the hearts and minds of the public. So in a way, it's soft power, but when it's institutionalized, like China has for the past several decades, it's become, a really influential force in the world. By some estimates and based on some of the government documents that are available, the United Front Work Department employs thousands of personnel. So their goal is to advance the Chinese Communist Party's goals, both inside China and outside China. And it's the outside China part that's interesting, because we've only started to learn about it. For some reason, it hasn't been a really popular area of study, even though this has been happening for decades. So in 2016, like you mentioned, the United Front Work Department added a new bureau, and this was focused on overseas and returning Chinese students. So people like Dan, who was really curious about the world, who might want to live overseas, or at least study overseas. And it seemed really clear that the Chinese government felt that these students were at risk of kind of becoming critics of the Chinese state from afar, that they would get these ideas from the free internet, from democratic countries, and somehow bring it back and negatively influence Chinese society. It might, in their minds, kind of foment criticism and dissent against Chinese Communist Party rule. So more resources were poured into these efforts. And that explains why someone like Dan, who is completely unknown, not a public figure, only 2 followers, like you said, on Twitter, who isn't a political activist at all, that the police would try to preempt his, what they would view as kind of brainwashing by the West by really clamping down and using not soft power in this case, but like hard, sharp power, which is they went right to his parents before even reaching out to Dan to be like, remove these posts, please. They went hard and went to his family members. And you can just imagine like feeling just so worried about your parents because of something you did that you knew, you understood was risky. And this happens so often. It happens to so many people of Chinese descent, primarily, who do research, who try to contribute, because as my book also looks at, a lot of countries don't have the breadth of China knowledge that it needs to try to understand what's changing. And people of Chinese descent, people who already speak and read Mandarin Chinese perfectly, are great assets and can provide a lot of insights. But I spoke with people like Vicky Xu in Australia, who's been such a victim of just huge amounts of harassment and threats. And she knows that basically she shouldn't return to China, where she was born, because she would likely be imprisoned. Her parents' family have been routinely threatened, and they want her to change her Chinese name because they're so worried about her. There's a few people like that who continue to speak out, but I think for the majority, like Dan, even though they don't want to, they end up kind of just giving in because they don't think it's worth it to risk their family's lives. And it raises these questions about what do democratic countries do for these people when police don't even take the statement, when there's no legislation in Canada or most countries, any country actually, that tries to gather information about these things happening and to respond to them and try to prevent them. Even in Australia, which has passed some foreign interference laws, these are mostly voluntary, where if you have a connection to a foreign state, you should now register it, for example. And there's some new restrictions on political donations because they had some problems in Australia with businessmen well connected with the Chinese government endorsing certain Australian politicians who then appeared to promise to support Beijing's stance on various affairs. But it doesn't go to the nitty-gritty of all of these people who are living in fear, who are threatened and harassed all over the world. None of the laws anywhere in the world really addresses how to protect them and how to cultivate and feel comfortable these group of people that can provide so much insights into our understanding of China today.
So they are wasted it's a wasted resource. Countries aren't drawing on the social capital in populations. In China Unbound, you look at a wide range of national responses to China's increasingly outward thrust, which includes things like United Front work, but of course it also includes China's very large scale investments, which are partly a consequence of the fact that China is very flush with foreign exchange earnings and needs to be investing its money outside of the country, but is also part of geostrategic strategies on behalf of the Chinese state, including the so-called Belt and Road Initiative and things like that. And the range of responses to China's investment range from Greece, where you have a fascinating visit and you find that both on a national level and on an individual level, the Greek ruling class have eagerly embraced a stronger role of the Chinese Communist Party in their economy and to some extent in their politics as well. On the other hand, countries like Australia, that after becoming tightly enmeshed in Chinese economy and intrigues and politics, have taken a very heavy approach to combating Beijing's influence. And Canada, where does it stand in this? It's had a real roller coaster in its relations with China, to put it very mildly, especially in recent weeks, and is in a position more like Australia's, in that it's become so estranged from any idea of engagement with China that it seems unlikely that it'll continue. Yet it has the Canadian business class and the major corporations are still very eager about maintaining ties with China and have a big influence on both of the major political federal parties. First of all, where do you see in the spectrum of ways to respond to China's sometimes excessive forward pressures? Where do you see Canada fitting in, and what are its possibilities for action?
Yeah, so thank you for both asking those questions and also providing a really concise summary of that section of my book, because after being so, engaged in this work, it's hard for me to do like as concise a summary as you just did. So my subtitle, China Unbound, A New World Disorder, I don't want it to come across as putting all the blame on Beijing, putting all the blame on China for creating this kind of disorderly state of global relations with itself. Actually, the book, focusing on Western countries, Western democracies' relationship with Beijing, really puts under the spotlight and criticizes what Western governments have failed to understand about China. First of all of these countries I visited, especially in Europe, actually, the lack of China knowledge, the lack of any formal China studies in universities. In Greece, people told me there's no way to really study China at a post-secondary level. Greeks who want to learn more about Asia and China ended up having to study in the UK and leaving their country to get deeper knowledge, and that's not good when the Greek government is kind of creating such strong ties with China, who feel that China is basically going to be its major economic partner going forward. So it just, regardless of Beijing's aims and activities and its ambitions on the world stage, it's not a good sign that all these countries don't have people who are knowledgeable about China at all. So the government of Greece was a really interesting case study, really interesting for me to visit, because I went to this port of Piraeus, and right close to downtown Athens, which was on its last legs, like really decrepit, like really not being very productive as a major port of the country. So a Chinese state-owned company came in and offered to take it over for a lease of several decades, and to basically take over the management, take over the payroll, everything. So the Greek government was really, really grateful for this, because the debt crisis and everything, it was losing goodwill from its European neighbors, and struggling to get loans that it would find it difficult to repay. So they leased it to this Chinese state-owned company, Costco. And within years, it was a success story, actually. Costco successfully really dramatically increased production and productivity and efficiency of the port. So the Greek government seemed to be very grateful. So speaking with analysts there, they're not sure if this was actually kind of an actual spoken arrangement, but within years, so this deal happened in around 2016. So in 2017, Athens vetoed a high-profile EU criticism of human rights abuses in China. It was the first time the EU as a bloc failed to criticize human rights in China in this way, which was a big deal because the EU had prided itself on speaking out at the UN about things like LGBT rights and things like that. So this happened twice at the UN level, with Greece being the country that vetoed. So people wondered, was this a condition of the Piraeus port deal? But the understanding of people who were, close to people in government was that this was more government officials preemptively showing gratitude to China to may perhaps safeguard continuing investments. So it wasn't clear that it was actually an explicit requirement. But this raises questions that China's new Silk Road project, which has billions in investment, mostly from China, to infrastructure improvements all around the world, to improve trade routes, whether this economic help to often struggling and economically weaker countries might come with strings attached, or if countries will just be eager to abandon its previously expressed principles to basically side with China on the international level. And I also provided some research from my time in Beijing, where the State Council, the Chinese government, was really open about what it envisions a new world order to look like. And it wants all types of government types, including authoritarian government types or one-party states, no democracies, to be treated equally on the world stage. So Beijing calls this democracy among world nations, where regardless of your domestic situation, or if there's much of a civil society at all, that other countries don't have the right to interfere or to criticize what you're doing. And this is concerning if this growing economic power comes along with some political allyship as well, because what we see happening in China is the internment, for example, of 1 million Uyghurs of Muslim faith in Xinjiang. So actually, the international backlash in the last couple of years have, by all accounts, actually been effective in reducing the number of Uyghurs who are being detained, and the camps have been
let's turn
slowly
to
shutting
that.
down.
Let's turn to that question for a moment, because this is another next door to Greece. You visit somebody fairly extraordinary in Turkey. I think the world is well aware, at least for the last couple of years, of the mass incarceration in re-education camps of members of the religiously Muslim Uyghur minority in Xinjiang province. But what you find, much as with the United Front Work Department interfering with people outside China, is that people who are ethnically Uyghur living outside China also end up caught up and sometimes shackled up in re-education camps if they happen into China. So this is very alarming, that it seems to be the persecution. You find a woman who is not a resident of China who wound up spending quite a long time locked up in one of these camps.
Yeah, so in Istanbul, because when I was living in Beijing, often I covered human rights issues and legal issues, and every year it got harder and harder because my sources who in the past would speak to me on the phone, some of them would just stop using any apps and stop contact with journalists. Definitely in Xinjiang, it became more and more difficult for journalists to travel there. Your colleague, Nathan Vanderclip, would try to go to Xinjiang, and his computer, his hotel would be ransacked. They would be followed everywhere. My friend Sophia Yan for The Telegraph, in her recent trip to Xinjiang to try to see what was happening, she and her cameraman were assaulted. She ended up with a bloody lip. So definitely, since I left China as a correspondent in late 2018, I wasn't going to imagine that I would get a visa again to travel there and then to go to Xinjiang to do reporting. So a lot of the information that we received from people of Uyghur descent and other minorities who got caught up in the internment camps are people who managed to either escape or who were, like the woman I met, were eventually released after a long period of detention. A lot of them have fled to Turkey because a lot of Uyghurs feel that in Turkey, the language is similar. It's a majority Muslim country. It's going to be more accepting of them. And indeed, I visited a neighborhood that's basically called Little Xinjiang. Like there's Uyghurs who have lived there actually for decades, who have set up shops and have accepted some of the more recent exiles and refugees. But the Turkish state doesn't, while not deporting them at this point, does not provide them with citizenship. So they're living in a state of limbo. So meeting them even in Turkey was kind of risky. I was really grateful for those who did speak with me. Several of them insisted on using their real names because they felt they were so lucky to have left China, to have led China. And by using their real names and faces, they were doing all they can to try to help save their family members, who many of them are still in the camps. So the woman I met, she's actually from Kazakhstan, and she was traveling to Xinjiang back and forth to trade in textiles because she kind of had a woman's clothing shop. So she wanted to buy cloth in bulk. China being kind of the factory of the world still in some respect, it was cheaper, better to go to Xinjiang to get her goods. For some reason, police picked her up at her hotel room, and she did not speak Mandarin Chinese. I don't think she barely spoke a word of Chinese. So they did not have a translator for her into Kazakh and brought her to this camp, this sprawling, camp site, and brought her underground and interrogated her every day. She screamed when she saw the conditions she was going to live in for the next 15 months with about 40 women just crammed into these rooms. They had to take turns sleeping because there wasn't enough space on the floor for everyone to sleep at the same time. And a lot of them were shackled. She was shackled the whole time, so much so that when she was finally released, the nurses couldn't take the shackles off her legs because it had basically become enmeshed with her skin, especially since they were barely able to have showers. So meeting her, looking into her eyes, like, it's really just incredibly just terrifying what so much of humanity in that region has been suffering. So yeah, a lot of what we know are coming from brave people who survived it and are speaking to journalists. So I was that's just one story out of many in the book that I try to portray and try to weave together with the context and the history, so that it's not just this is terrible, this is terrible, this is terrible, but trying to get readers to really understand the context in which these arose, and also the different opportunities along the way that world governments had to learn about it sooner. I talked about how the UN failed to say anything for years, even though there were media reports coming out of what was happening, but the international community was really, really slow to respond, to the point where by the time they responded, it was already happening for years. Entire villages were basically almost empty at this point by the time the world finally kind of woke up to what was happening, despite journalists having created credible reporting for years before it became more of a major issue. I think it really became more in people's minds maybe around last year. So again, the book is really talking not just about what China is doing, but what democracies had failed to do. Because I think in many cases, governments mostly saw their China policy as primarily focused on how to expand trade ties and economic ties with China as much as possible. And when it existed, any criticism or research in human rights kind of took part on a different diplomatic track as if they could be separate. But here in Canada, I think what really changed the status quo was the hostage taking of the two Michaels, who were just released after Meng Wanzhou, her case was resolved in the US. The hostage taking of these two middle-class privileged Canadian white men really somehow seemed to wake people up that trying to have it all with China in many cases isn't going to work. After Canada arrested Meng Wanzhou at the behest of the US Justice Department, it wasn't only the hostage taken on the political side. China also slapped tariffs on Canadian canola pork. So then there were also repercussions on the economic side too. So it was no longer parallel tracks of we could criticize and talk about human rights on one side, but enjoy no interruption to our trade relationships with China on the other end.
It was as if for many democracies, it took a few years longer than it should have to notice that China had changed under Xi Jinping's
Yeah.
rule, that it was no longer the case that increasing engagement with China would lead to greater liberalization, that as was the case previously, China was a country of many different organizations and you could engage differently with cities and states and so on, which had very different political systems than the national government, or with media organizations and so on. Over a period of just a few years after Xi Jinping came in power, China became very homogenous, and I think the word totalitarian, you can say it was a shift from authoritarian to totalitarian rule. And a lot of countries didn't notice that for a very long time after it was being reported by people like you in detail and perhaps should have been known. So as I said, there's this sort of spectrum ranging from countries like African countries and Greece that still see China as an economic savior, and are willing to endure or ignore the political repressions, the crushing of democracy, the ethnic internment. And then there are countries that are fighting back, and we'll talk later about whether that has backlash for the population. But where does Canada fit into that spectrum, and where should it fit, particularly given what it has now been through with the de facto hostage crisis?
Yeah, so I would just add to your comment that it's true that on like the village level, there are like some forms of democracy, and before some private media organizations in China were able to do some work that was more critical, and that has just tightened and tightened.
Yeah.
But the overall system hasn't changed. Like, it had always been the case that the Chinese Communist Party was above the law, that rule of law didn't exist. And I think with the two Michaels case where they were brazenly taken hostage, that was when a lot of people in democratic countries really kind of grasp what it meant for the country for decades to have had such a high conviction rate, where there's a 99.9% conviction rate. So if you appear before a judge in China, you're pretty much 100% guaranteed to be found guilty. So in some ways, there's been a dramatic tightening under Xi, but in other ways, the warning signs have been there all along. When China joined the WTO in 2000, I think Bill Clinton and other influential leaders kind of created this idea that with more engagement, economic engagement, China's political system would become more liberal. But China, in joining WTO and other organizations, did not make that bargain themselves. They never made those promises. So when Xi came to power and things got so much worse, it seemed a lot of people felt betrayed, that what they thought was going to happen was not happening. But in fact, I spoke with people who felt that shift, this betrayal, and they admitted that, in fact, China did not make this promise. It was kind of like a myth and an expectation that people in the West perpetuated amongst ourselves. So noting that in Canada, definitely, I think it was pretty prevalent among Canadian leaders that this would be the case. So kind of passing the buck along, not wanting to create any different types of China policies. And also, I think Canada, as what's called in international relations theory, being a middle power, being a sovereign state that is not a global giant but still has significant influence. I think Canada and a lot of European states sees middle power as less influential than middle powers actually are. Actually, middle powers do have significant clout and power. Canada punches above its weight. We're a member of the G7, we're a member of NATO, we're a member of the Five Eyes Intelligence Sharing Alliance. So actually, despite our modest population size, we actually have some power, some influence, some leverage on other countries like China, but that Canada just wasn't thinking about using in the past. And when it came to crisis mode, when we had this hostage taking of Canadians, suddenly, because Canada felt that we weren't that big of a deal, there wasn't any kind of infrastructure or thinking in place on how to respond to these challenges. I heard from multiple sources that when the Meng Wanzhou saga was unfolding, when the two Michaels were taken at a meeting of the Privy Council, the clerk, the senior official, looked around the room and said, where the F are the China people? Where are the experts we need to deal with this? And the anecdote shows that there was a state of panic going on in Canada because the basic amount of expertise that should be in government on China wasn't in place. So Canada was scrambling and playing catch up, which isn't an ideal place to be in. And also personally, like, I'm not like a hawkish person. The purpose of this book partly is to provide a lot of context and nuance and to try to explain motivations from within the Chinese state, so that, because I think the level of misunderstanding can sometimes reach such a fever pitch that people just become so hawkish. They're basically calling and cheering on for a second Cold War to start with China. So I personally don't think that it's wrong to continue engagement economically, and not if it was realistic to even end economic ties, which at this point I really don't think is realistic, with China being such a huge market and being a country with many private entrepreneurs, many private companies. It's not all just state-owned companies that you could, stop working with. It's more an issue of being prepared and being understanding what China is like today, how the Chinese political legal system works, what China is willing to do to try to get control over the narrative about itself all over the world, that it's been willing since at least the 80s and 90s, that we know been willing to threaten people who criticize the Chinese government from overseas. In the past, it was mostly people of Chinese descent. And I think some of the Western systemic racism and xenophobia also comes into play, because these people who are direct targets of the Chinese state overseas were trying to warn our societies about what was happening, but often they would be ignored. Like, even if they spoke in front of Canadian Parliament, Parliament won't do anything about it. In 2010, I don't know if you remember, our spy chief of CSIS, Richard Fadden, he warned Canadian government that there were these foreign influence interference efforts coming, and that was targeting Canadian politicians. But his comments were so unpopular that members of Parliament called on him to be fired. I think he's since been vindicated.
It was a big controversy anyway, and I mean, you're entirely right to bring it up, but whether that was an appropriate response gets to the heart of some of the really interesting things you get into later in the book, which is this question, as you were just saying, of whether of how you can confront the Chinese state's excesses in countries like this, in a country like Canada that has millions of citizens of Chinese ethnicity, many of whom their families have been in Canada as long as the country has existed almost, without creating a backlash of racism and paranoia that attacks it. And this becomes personal for you in this book. I don't think you probably set out to write a book about yourself, but you ended up personally intertwined in this story in some rather extraordinary ways, involving paranoid people, involving Steve Bannon making a movie based on you that was not particularly flattering. How do you personally deal with this problem that China or the Chinese comes to be in the minds of many Canadians and Americans and Australians, not just the name of a state and a regime, but of an entire people of a certain ethnicity within their own country?
Yeah, well, thank you for raising that, because I felt like the whole time, anytime I write about China, I need to be so careful. Basically, every time I write or even tweet out a story, I have to remind people, and I shouldn't need to remind people, that I'm talking about the Chinese state. I'm not talking about the Chinese people. There's 1.4 billion people in China. And I think for people who haven't visited China, haven't lived there, it's easier for them to kind of think of all of these people as robots or the same, and not know the diversity in China and all the struggles within Chinese civil society to hang on to the little bits of space it has to be expressive. Instead, I think unfortunately, a lot of the China dialogue we have gives into this blanket notions of talking about the Chinese and China being this malevolent force in the world. And that really makes things difficult for people who care about human rights, who care about providing some criticism of what Beijing is doing, because we worry that by doing this, people who would rather, tar everyone with one brush will take that as ammunition to further spread fear and misinformation about all Chinese people. And my last chapter on the US was particularly focused on these issues. I think the disinformation, misinformation coming for 4 years from President Trump himself, from the president himself on China, was incredibly damaging. We saw so many physical acts of violence against people of Asian descent, where it would be indiscriminate. If you look vaguely East Asian, a lot of people were just attacked on the streets because people felt that Chinese people were the problem, were the reason why all sorts of issues. In Vancouver, I've been dealing with myself where people have called me slurs, the C word on the streets, blamed me for driving up real estate prices, for being basically a colonizer, whereas I'm like, I'm a journalist. I take the SkyTrain to work. So much of this xenophobia and fear. So in my book, I tried to counteract that by having a lot of the experts themselves being of people of the Chinese diaspora who come at it from different perspectives, not only activist perspectives, different viewpoints. And I think that's a good antidote, because when you are Chinese yourself, or if you have some cultural family tie to China, it's harder to just speak about China in such simplistic ways. It's not really possible when that's your family, when that's your community. And so I think that helps. But for me, the Bannon whole situation you're talking about really drove home to me that how just powerful misinformation can be, where a whole movie can be made that purports to be true, which is just made up in so many respects, and just there's exaggerating, and then there's just misinformation and disinformation. So in 2019, I interviewed the former Canadian ambassador to China, John McCallum, about the Meng Wanzhou and the Two Michaels case. And McCallum at the time, he contradicted the prime minister. He said that a deal would be good for Canadians. Canada, should accept this deal. And he was dismissed by Trudeau because, as the top diplomat, he was contradicting his country, basically. So I was just asking questions as a journalist, but for some reason, Steve Bannon and some other people thought it was some sort of kind of crusading act of journalism where I was taking down someone who was a friend of China's, like a stooge for China. And he made this movie about it where the journalist was called Jane, and my partner had the same hair cell as my husband, and the cat that someone killed to threaten the journalist in the movie looked just like my cat. So since then, I've completely scrubbed my social media of anything personal.
To be clear, your cat was not killed in your actual life.
No, my cat was not killed, luckily, and I wasn't threatened. I got a lot of anonymous death threats for the interview because some accounts that looked like they were accounts that were supportive of the CCP felt that I did something bad for China by interviewing the ambassador. But it wasn't anything like the movie. So things like that. But he made that movie and wanted to show it to the president as a way to help the president be tougher on China. So that was mortifying for me, that anything connected to me would be shown to a leader of the most powerful country in the world as a way to shape China policy, instead of the many, many very experienced and knowledgeable China experts that American universities, American institutions, media has. A lot of these more moderate voices who just want to stick with the facts and not be in a race to be as hyperbolic about China as possible, they don't get the airtime. They're not on primetime TV. They're not in senior levels of government. So I think that's very unfortunate, because I do believe that what the Chinese government is doing is worrying enough. Embellishing it further or just making things up is not going to help. I think just sticking with the facts is what we need to do.
And on that, I almost feel like that's a good line to end it on. How close are we to the hour now?
It's 2:05,
so we could okay. And are any of the video people there? Do you want another question, another beat? Hello?
Yeah, hi. If you want to round off with a final question, that's good.
Okay. Let me put it this way. Here we go. So, Joanna, you end up taking a balanced approach to this, probably based on your own very complex perceptions of this. That there does need to be a more informed and proactive stance among Western democracies that's more aware of the multiple Chinese actions from the Chinese state in the world, economically and ideologically, and in terms of espionage and interference with citizens. On the other hand, you document very well the dangers of becoming excessive, like you said earlier, of treating this like a Cold War, of demonizing not just a country, but its people and its diaspora. And you've experienced yourself some of the pain of this. Do you think there is a way forward that is neither a Cold War nor is it simply acquiescent to what's become a dangerous and threatening state, not least to its own people?
Yeah, so a lot of the criticisms that I have come out of the place of really worrying about Chinese people I lived with and got to become really good friends with in China. But that's not the place where some criticism of China seem to be coming from. It seems to, especially from the US and some other countries, seem to be coming from a place of wanting to compete with China, to beat China. All of this language of we can't let China win, we can't let China do this or do that, doesn't seem to be really coming from a place of concern over people like the Uyghurs or what's happening in Hong Kong, which is where I was born, where Hong Kong, which was promised the same degree of rule of law and press freedom for 50 years, is now under such tightening under the national security law, which criminalizes really basic expression about the Chinese political system. Like sources I had in Hong Kong who I spoke freely with, I met freely with, who were in government, are now in jail for charges like subversion. And Claudia Mo, for example, a former pro-democracy legislator in Hong Kong, she was denied bail because a judge looked at her seized WhatsApp messages and saw that she spoke frequently with foreign media. So because she spoke about Hong Kong with foreign journalists, that was cause to basically call her dangerous to China's national security. So I'm coming from a place where I'm really concerned about all of those things. But when conversations aren't couched and on a very human level about what to do about these challenges and be delicate about it and to be careful about it when it's couched in we're entering a new Cold War. We can't let China win. We can't let China be the major world power over the US. Then I think it further stokes defensiveness and anger from the Chinese state, which isn't going to be helpful to the overall situation. Meanwhile, I think now it's not at the point where there's not engagement. Actually, after China slapped some trade sanctions, tariffs on Canada, for example, these were temporary, and then they were lifted. And once, the ban on imports of pork, canola, for example, were lifted, trade levels actually returned higher to its previous levels. So engagement is continuing, regardless of how bad things look diplomatically. There's actually not been that many disruptions. And there's also Beijing foreign ministry officials continue to have embassies overseas. They continue to show up and engage at world forums. So the avenues for diplomacy aren't cut. But I think now there's an opportunity for smarter diplomacy and better informed negotiations, discussions with Chinese counterparts. But there's been analysis of who's in the US cabinet, who's advising the government in Canada. And personally, I don't feel confident that various governments have a lot of expertise among its leaders and consultants on China. I worry that these avenues that are still open at kind of engaging and speaking with Chinese officials on how to address some of these issues, to put pressure on them in different ways. That's not going to war to lessen its crackdowns on its people. I worry these avenues will gradually shrink and we'll be losing these opportunities to try to make a difference in all of these people's lives.
Yes, I think your book in many ways is a call for informed expertise above all else. I certainly agree with your perception that I've seen over the last 15 years or so many times where the Canadian government, faced with a crisis involving China, has turned not to its body of experts within the Foreign Affairs Department, because there really isn't one, but this has turned to business leaders and has called business leaders into the Prime Minister's office and trusted their knowledge of China and their claims to be friends with the president of China and things like that as their main source of policy advice. And I think what you've helped do is give a sense that this is a problem in other countries as well, that the democracies of the world are not really living up to their principles in being informed in their engagement with another country this way.
Yeah, and also living up to its principles of doing something when people living in their countries that complain of visits from Chinese officials, threatening, receiving death threats and things. Countries should also live up to its principles to do something about this. Right now, basically, I've personally went to police for things that I've encountered, and police were really candid with me, saying that there's really nothing in the books in Canadian law that can protect when sources of intimidation are coming from outside the country.
Yeah, which is an extraordinary thing. And I think it is a huge unaddressed problem that needs to be dealt with. So one of many things that we can take away from this book that's useful. Joanna, thank you for taking the time to outline this. I would highly recommend everybody read this book, because aside from being a really informed reporter's analysis of many, many countries, it also contains a lot of very moving stories about individuals and their own encounters and experiences, and about Joanna's own experiences as a reporter attempting to gather these stories. It's a beautifully woven book, and I'm really glad to have had the chance to talk with you about it.
Thank you so much for reading so carefully and for your great questions. It means a lot that as a writer, someone read so carefully and understands some of the points I was trying to make. It's definitely not an easy book to sum up or to have talking points about.
True. All right,
Indeed.
thank you.
Thank you both
Thank you.
so much. The book is China Unbound, A New World Disorder. It is available now from our festival bookshop here on Granville Island and also at your favorite independent bookseller, wherever you may be. Doug Saunders and Joanna, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for this book, Joanna. And we wish you well as you continue to promote it and spread the word. You've been listening to Books and Ideas Audio, a presentation of the Vancouver Writers Fest. To hear more events like this one, please check our website at www.writersfest.bc.ca.